The whole courtroom stared at me like I had stolen their oxygen, but I just checked my watch. I wasn't afraid. I was simply waiting for the right man to walk through those doors. My family believes they are suing a Leech, but in reality, they just activated a trap with their own signatures. Once the gatekeeper arrives, this money stops being a family matter. It becomes a contract. My name is Tara Mendez, and if you believe the performance currently taking place in courtroom 4 of the Ridgefield County Probate Court, I was not a granddaughter. I was a parasite. I was a vulture circling a carcass. I was, to quote my younger sister directly, a leech. I sat alone at the defendant's table. The wood under my fingertips felt greasy, worn smooth by decades of sweaty palms belonging to people who were either desperate to keep their money or desperate to steal someone else's. I was neither. I was simply punctual. Your Honor, this is not just a matter of probate, Blair's lawyer boomed. He was a man named Sterling, wearing a suit that cost more than my car and carrying an ego that barely fit through the double doors. He pointed a manicured finger at me, a theatrical gesture clearly rehearsed in front of a mirror. We are talking about elder abuse. We are talking about the systematic isolation of a vulnerable man by a woman who saw him not as a grandfather, but as a bank vault. Ms. Mendez seized control of Harlan Mendez's life during his final 2 years. She restricted access. She monitored calls. She is a leech who drained him dry before his body was even cold. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I did not look at the gallery where the vultures were roosting. I just looked at the silver face of my analog watch. The second hand swept past the 10:28 in the morning. 2 minutes. We are requesting an immediate emergency injunction, Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a grave, serious register that I recognized instantly. It was the voice men used when they were trying to sell you something broken. We ask the court to freeze all assets and appoint Blair Mendez as the temporary administrator to prevent further dissipation of the estate. The family is terrified, Your Honor, terrified that by the time we untangle this web of manipulation, there will be nothing left of their beloved father's legacy. Behind him, sitting in the front row like a portrait of grief painted by a colorblind artist, were my parents, Dorian and Kendra Mendez. My father wore black, a tie I had bought him 5 years ago for Christmas strangling his thick neck. My mother was dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, her face a mask of carefully applied tragedy. It was what I called hypocritical makeup. She had contoured her cheekbones to look gaunt, to look like she hadn't slept in weeks. But I knew for a fact she had spent yesterday at the spa because the charge had hit the shared emergency card I still monitored. They looked devastated. They looked righteous. And underneath the performance, I could see the hunger. It was a physical thing, a tightness in their jaws, a sharpness in the way they watched the judge. They were not mourning a man. They were mourning a delay in their deposit. Blair sat next to her lawyer, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed sobs. She was wearing a modest navy dress, something she must have bought specifically for this occasion because Blair did not do modest. She did sequins. She did plunging necklines. Today, however, she was the grieving granddaughter, the victim of her cold, calculating sister. Ms. Mendez? Judge Calloway's voice cut through the humidity of the courtroom. He looked tired. He was a man who had spent 30 years watching families tear each other apart over grandmother's china and grandfather's stocks. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses, his expression unreadable. Ms. Mendez, he repeated, sharper this time. Counsel has made a motion for emergency control of the assets based on allegations of undue influence and dissipation. Do you have an objection? The room went silent. The air conditioner hummed, a low rattling sound that seemed to underline the tension. Blair stopped sobbing for a microsecond, holding her breath. My father leaned forward, his knuckles white on the wooden rail. They were waiting for me to scream. They were waiting for me to stand up and deny it, to shout that I loved my grandfather, to engage in the mudslinging match they had prepared for. They wanted a fight because a fight meant chaos, and chaos was where they thrived. I did not stand up. I looked at my watch again. 10:29. I looked up at Judge Calloway, keeping my face completely blank. No, Your Honor, I do not object. Not yet. The judge blinked. Not yet? Ms. Mendez, this is a legal proceeding, not a waiting room. Either you object to the motion to freeze the assets, or you do not. I am waiting for the gatekeeper, I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any inflection. It was the voice I used at work when telling a CEO that his company was insolvent. A ripple of whispers broke out in the gallery behind me. I could hear the words floating through the stale air. Cold, heartless. Look at her. She doesn't even care. No blood in her veins. The gatekeeper? Sterling scoffed, turning to the judge with a smirk. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of erratic, nonsensical behavior the family has been dealing with. She thinks this is a game. She thinks she can stall this court while she hides funds offshore or transfers titles. Judge Calloway frowned, tapping his pen on the bench. Ms. Mendez, if you do not have legal representation present, I highly suggest you find some. If you do not provide a valid legal reason to stop this motion, I am inclined to grant the emergency request given the severity of the accusations. I understand, I said, and then I went back to silence. Sterling took this as a victory lap. He nudged Blair, and she stood up, ready to deliver the monologue of her life. She walked to the witness stand, wiping her eyes, looking small and fragile. I just want to know why, Blair whispered into the microphone, her voice trembling. I just want to know why she wouldn't let us see him. For 2 years, Your Honor, 2 years. Every time I called. Tara picked up. She said he was sleeping. She said he was sick. She said he didn't want to speak to us. She looked directly at me then, tears streaming down her face. It was a masterclass. If I didn't know her, I would have believed her. I went to the house, Blair continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by the attention. Last Christmas, I just wanted to give Grandpa his present. I stood on the porch and knocked for 20 minutes. I knew they were in there. I could see the lights, but she changed the locks. She changed the locks on the house our family has owned for 40 years. Who does that? Who locks a daughter out of her own father's house on Christmas Eve? Objection, Sterling shouted. Though it was his own witness speaking, it was a performative objection, a way to underscore the point. Your Honor, the witness is distraught. Overruled, the judge sighed. Let her speak. She acted like she owned him, Blair sobbed, gripping the edges of the stand. She controlled his food. She controlled his medication. I think she was drugging him. He wasn't himself the last time I saw him. He was zombie-like. And she was just standing there, watching him like a prison warden. She is a leech. She lived there rent-free, eating his food, spending his pension, while Mom and Dad were struggling to pay their mortgage. She took everything. I sat there, my hands folded on the table, listening to every word. I watched the court reporter's fingers flying across the stenotype machine. Click, click, click. That was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Most people in my position would have interrupted. They would have shouted that Blair hadn't called in 6 months. They would have shouted that the Christmas visit happened at 3 a.m. when the entire family was drunk and trying to crash a car through the garage door. They would have shouted that the only reason I lived there was because Grandpa needed 24-hour care and the struggling parents had refused to pay for a nurse. But I learned a long time ago that you never interrupt an enemy when they are busy destroying themselves. I needed this on the record. I needed the court reporter to capture every syllable of her accusation. I needed, she changed the locks in black and white. I needed, she drugged him, typed out and certified. I needed the judge to hear Blair claim, under oath, that her grandfather was zombie-like and incapable of making decisions. The more she spoke, the tighter the noose became. She turned him against us, Blair wailed. She told him lies. She told him we only wanted his money. That is projection. Your Honor, that is exactly what she was doing. She is the one with no job. She is the one with no husband, no prospects, nothing but that house and his bank accounts. She manipulated a dying man because she was too lazy to work for herself. My father let out a loud, pained groan from the gallery, burying his face in his hands. My mother put an arm around him, glaring at me with eyes that promised retribution. Judge Calloway looked at me. Ms. Mendez? These are serious allegations. Do you have any cross-examination? Do you have any response to the claim that you isolated the decedent? I looked at the judge. Then I looked at my watch. 10:30. Ms. Mendez! The judge's patience was evaporating. I am about to rule on the motion. Just 10 more seconds, Your Honor, I said softly. This is outrageous. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. She is mocking this court. She is mocking the grief of this family. I demand that the motion be granted immediately and that Ms. Mendez be held in contempt. 5 seconds, I whispered to myself. Blair was still on the stand, breathing hard, her face flushed with the exertion of her performance. She looked triumphant. She thought she had won. She thought that because I was silent, I was defeated. She thought the world worked on volume, that whoever screamed the loudest got to write the history. She was about to learn that the world actually works on paperwork. 3, 2, 1. I turned my head toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Right on cue, the handle turned. The heavy wood groaned as it was pushed open. The air in the room seemed to shift. It wasn't a wind, but a pressure change. The frantic, hot, emotional energy that Blair and Sterling had whipped up suddenly hit a wall of absolute zero. A man stepped through the door. He was not flashy. He did not look like Sterling with his Italian wool and silk tie. This man was wearing a gray suit that looked like it had been bought off the rack at a department store 5 years ago. The shoulders were slightly too wide. The fabric was a blend that probably shone under fluorescent lights. He carried a leather briefcase that was scuffed at the corners, the handle worn dark from use. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like an auditor. He looked like the kind of man who found a missing decimal point that sent people to prison. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Blair. He didn't look at the weeping parents. He walked straight down the center aisle, his shoes making a rhythmic, purposeful clack, clack, clack on the floor. Sterling turned, annoyed. "Excuse me? We are in the middle of a hearing. Who are you?" The man ignored him. He walked past the bar, pushed open the little swinging gate without asking for permission, and approached the court clerk's desk. He placed a thick, sealed manila envelope on the desk. Then he turned to the judge. "Your Honor," the man said. His voice was dry, devoid of emotion, and carried to the back of the room without him needing to raise it. "My name is Arthur Prosser. I am the senior representative for Stonegate Fiduciary Services. I am here to file the appearance of the successor trustee for the Harlan Mendez Revocable Trust, which became irrevocable precisely 48 hours ago upon the death of the grantor." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This wasn't the silence of anticipation. This was the silence of a bomb squad realizing the wire they just cut was the wrong one. Sterling froze. "Trust? What trust? We were not notified of any trust. We are here for probate of the estate." Arthur Prosser finally looked at Sterling. It was a look of mild boredom. "There is no estate to probate. Counselor, all assets previously belonging to Mr. Harlan Mendez were retitled into the trust 18 months ago. This court has no jurisdiction over the distribution of those assets, and your client has no standing to demand control over them." Blair's mouth fell open. The tears stopped instantly, as if someone had turned off a faucet. My father stood up, his face losing its flushed anger and turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. "That's a lie," he blurted out. "Dad didn't trust banks. He didn't trust anyone but family." Arthur Prosser didn't even blink. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second document. "I also have here a certified copy of the trust instrument. Specifically, I would like to draw the court's attention to Article 9, Section 4. The judge took the envelope, tore it open, and pulled out the document. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. His eyebrows shot up. "The no contest clause," Judge Calloway read aloud. his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Yes, Your Honor," Prosser said, "and as the appointed trustee, I am legally obligated to enforce it to the letter, every single word." I sat back in my chair and finally let out a breath. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched the blood drain from Blair's face as she realized that the trap hadn't been set by me. It had been set by her. And she had just spent the last 20 minutes jumping into it with both feet. The gatekeeper had arrived, and as I had predicted, the time for family drama was over. Now, it was just business. The temperature in the courtroom did not actually drop, but physically, it felt as though someone had opened a window to a meat locker. The humidity generated by Blair's tears and my father's suppressed rage evaporated the moment Arthur Prosser placed that envelope on the clerk's desk. It was a heavy, dull sound, the sound of dense paper hitting wood, and it echoed with more finality than the judge's gavel ever could. Sterling, who had been strutting like a peacock only moments before, seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. He looked at Arthur Prosser, and then he looked at the judge, and for the first time since the hearing began, I saw the flash of calculation in his eyes. He was a contingency lawyer. He ate what he killed, and he was looking at Prosser and realizing there might be no meat on this bone. "I object," Sterling barked, though the force was gone from his voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We have no knowledge of a trust. We have no knowledge of this individual. We have a filed petition for probate based on the assumption of intestacy or a prior will. You cannot simply ambush a legal proceeding with surprise witnesses." Judge Calloway ignored him. He was looking at Arthur Prosser with an expression that bordered on relief. Probate judges hate family squabbles. They hate the he said, she said of emotional warfare. They love professional fiduciaries because professional fiduciaries bring order. They bring spreadsheets. They bring silence. "Mr. Sterling, sit down," the judge said, his voice flat. "Mr. Prosser has identified himself as a trustee. If a valid trust exists, this court needs to know about it immediately, because it determines whether I even have the authority to listen to your client weep any further." Sterling sat. But he sat on the edge of his chair, coiled and tense. Blair looked at him, confused. She wiped a smudge of mascara from her cheek. "What does that mean?" she whispered loudly enough for the microphones to catch. "What is a trust?" My parents, sitting behind her, were frozen. My father, Dorian, was a man who prided himself on knowing how the world worked. He thought the world worked on handshakes and bullying. He was staring at Arthur Prosser's cheap suit, trying to figure out the angle. He was trying to figure out how much it would cost to buy the man off. He didn't understand that you cannot buy off a corporate algorithm wrapped in a polyester blend. Judge Calloway picked up the envelope. He reached for a letter opener, a silver blade that glinted under the fluorescent lights. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp and violent in the quiet room. I watched his hands. I knew exactly what was inside. I had spent hours organizing those documents, categorizing them, scanning them, and ensuring they were bulletproof. I had not written them, that would have been a conflict of interest, but I had driven Grandpa to the offices of the most expensive, ruthless estate planning firm in Raleigh, and I had sat in the waiting room while he gave his instructions. The judge pulled out the first document. It was bound in a blue legal backing. He adjusted his glasses, reading the cover page, then flipped to the first substantive section. "This is a certificate of trust," Judge Calloway announced, looking up at the room. Dated October 14th, 2024, it names Stonegate Fiduciary Services as the sole successor trustee upon the death or incapacity of Harlan Mendez. He flipped another page. "And here is the schedule of assets," the judge continued. He scanned the list, his eyes moving back and forth. "It appears that the residence on Elm Street, the investment accounts at Vanguard, the checking accounts, and the savings bonds were all retitled into the name of the trust on November 1st, 2024. The judge looked over his glasses at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, your petition asks for control over the decedent's estate. But according to this, there is no estate. There is nothing to probate. The decedent died owning nothing in his personal name. Everything belongs to the trust. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Blair looked at her lawyer. "I don't get it," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "What do you mean, he owned nothing? The house is there. The money is there." Sterling turned to her, and I could see the contempt in his eyes. He was realizing he had wasted a morning on a client who didn't do her homework. "It means, Blair, that the court cannot give you the house because your grandfather didn't own it when he died. The trust owned it, and this man," he gestured angrily at Prosser, "controls the trust." My mother let out a sharp gasp. "But that's illegal. Tara must have forced him to sign it. He wouldn't sign his house away to a stranger." Arthur Prosser turned his head slowly. He looked at my mother with the dead, shark-like eyes of a man who has heard every excuse in the book. "Mrs. Mendez, I presume," Prosser said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that crushed the air out of the room. "I was personally present at the signing, as were 2 independent witnesses and a notary public. Mr. Mendez was also evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist that same morning to certify his capacity. The signing was video recorded. If you wish to challenge the validity of the trust based on capacity, you are welcome to try. However, I must warn you about Article 9. Prosser looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, if you would be so kind as to read the no contest clause, I believe it is on page 22. Judge Calloway flipped through the document. The pages rustled loudly. He found the section, ran his finger down the paragraph, and then stopped. He read it silently first, his lips moving slightly. Then he looked up, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met mine. There was a flicker of something there. Respect? Pity? It was hard to tell. Article 9, Section 4, the judge read. The no contest clause. It states that if any beneficiary under this trust, or any legal heir of the grantor, seeks to contest the validity of this trust, or attacks the appointment of the trustee, or seeks to invalidate any provision of this instrument in any court of law, then that person's share of the trust distribution shall be forfeited in its entirety. They shall be treated as if they had predeceased the grantor without living issue. The judge paused, letting the legal jargon sink in. Furthermore, the judge continued, the trustee is authorized to withhold any and all distributions to any beneficiary who is a party to such a legal challenge until the matter is fully resolved, and the defense costs for the trust shall be deducted from the share of the contesting party. Blair blinked. Predeceased? What does that mean? It means, I said, breaking my silence for the first time since Prosser entered. My voice was low, but in the dead quiet, it sounded like a gunshot. It means that if you sue, you are dead to the money. It means if you keep fighting, you get zero, not $1, not a cent. You don't just lose the lawsuit. Blair, you lose the inheritance you haven't even received yet. Blair's face went from pale to a blotchy red. She looked at Sterling. Is that true? Can he do that? Sterling was rubbing his temples. He looked like he had a migraine. It is a standard clause, Blair, and in North Carolina, they are enforceable if the contest is brought without probable cause. And considering the trustee just told us they have a video of the signing and a psychiatric evaluation, we have no probable cause. My father stood up again. He was shaking. This is a trick, he sputtered. Tara set this up. She's the one pulling the strings. You can't let a bank run our family. We are the family. I am his son. Arthur Prosser didn't even turn his body this time. He just shifted his gaze to my father. Mr. Mendez, Stonegate Fiduciary Services is not a bank. We are a private fiduciary firm. We answer to the document, not to the family. Our loyalty is to the instructions left by Harlan Mendez, and his instructions were explicit. He wanted his assets managed professionally to prevent, Prosser paused, checking a note on the file, to prevent vultures from picking the bones before the body is cold. That is a direct quote from his letter of intent. The word vultures hung in the air. It was a word I had heard Grandpa use 1,000 times. Hearing it come out of this gray, bureaucratic man's mouth made it real in a way that my own accusations never could. "We have an obligation to enforce every word," Prosser repeated. "If you continue with this emergency motion, Mr. Sterling, we will consider it a contest under Article 9. We will immediately zero out Blair Mendez's allocation and redirect it to the charitable remainder beneficiaries. Is that what you wish to do?" Sterling stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "No," he said quickly. "No, we withdraw the motion. Your Honor, we are withdrawing the motion for emergency control immediately." "Wait!" Blair grabbed his arm. "No, you can't stop. She stole it. She's sitting right there." "Shut up, Blair," Sterling hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You are about to lose everything. Shut your mouth." I watched them turn on each other. It was inevitable. When the money is easy, everyone is a team. When the money becomes difficult, alliances fracture. Blair looked at her lawyer with betrayal in her eyes. Then she looked at our parents. My mother was gripping her purse so tightly, her knuckles were white. She understood. She was the one who managed the family's debt. She knew what zero meant. She knew they were banking on this inheritance to pay off the second mortgage they had taken out to fund Blair's failed boutique business 2 years ago. "But," my mother stammered, "but the funeral costs, the medical bills, we were expecting—" "Submit the invoices to my office," Prosser said coldly. "If they are legitimate expenses of the estate, they will be reviewed. If they are personal debts, they will be rejected." He said "rejected" with the same tone one might use to say "deleted." My father collapsed back onto the bench. The fight had gone out of him. He looked small. He looked like what he was, a bully who had just realized the playground was closed. He had spent his whole life manipulating people. He gaslit my mother. He gaslit me. He gaslit his business partners. He thought reality was something you could bend if you just shouted loud enough or lied convincingly enough. But you cannot gaslight a contract. You cannot emotionally manipulate a trust document. You cannot bully a fiduciary who gets paid by the hour to be immune to your feelings. The realization hit him, and I saw his face go slack. He wasn't grieving his father. He was grieving his own powerlessness. Judge Calloway looked at me again. "Ms. Mendez, it appears the motion against you has been withdrawn. The assets are under the control of the trustee. You are free to go." I didn't move immediately. I looked at Blair. She was crying again. But these weren't the pretty, performative tears of the opening act. These were ugly, terrified tears. The mascara was running into her mouth. She looked like a child who had broken a vase and realized, for the first time, that no one was going to sweep up the pieces for her. "You knew," she hissed at me across the aisle. "You sat there and let me do this. You knew about the clause. You wanted me to lose it all." "I warned you," I said calmly. 3 days ago, I sent you an email. I told you not to file. I told you to wait for the reading of the will. You didn't open it. You blocked my address." "You could have told me today," she screamed. "You could have stopped me." "I am not your keeper, Blair," I said, "and I am certainly not your financial advisor." I stood up. My legs felt steady. I smoothed the skirt of my suit. I picked up my bag. Arthur Prosser was already packing up his briefcase. He didn't look at me, and I didn't look at him. We had no need for secret nods or winks. He was a professional doing a job. I was a beneficiary surviving a war. The air in the room had settled into a cold, sterile reality. The drama was dead. The soap opera had been canceled due to lack of funding. I walked toward the aisle. As I passed the bench where my parents sat, I could smell my mother's perfume, a heavy, floral scent that tried too hard to be expensive. It mixed with the smell of my father's sweat. "Tara," my father whispered. It was a command, or maybe a plea. "Tara, fix this." I didn't stop. I didn't look down. I kept my eyes on the exit sign at the back of the room. I let out a breath, a long, slow exhale that emptied my lungs of the stale courtroom air. I hadn't smiled once. I didn't feel like smiling. Victory in a family feud doesn't feel like winning a championship. It feels like surviving a surgery. You are alive, but you are missing parts of yourself that you can never get back. I walked past them. I walked past Sterling, who was furiously typing on his phone, probably trying to figure out how to bill them for a disaster. I walked past Blair, who was slumped on the table. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the hallway. The marble floor stretched out in front of me, cool and empty. Phase 1 was complete. The shield was up. The trust was secure. But I knew my family. I knew that when fear wore off, rage would set in. They wouldn't stop. They would just change tactics. They would try to attack the man who made the trust. They would try to attack the history. I checked my watch. 10:45. The trustee had just fired the first shot, but the war wasn't over. The war was just moving from the courtroom to the ledger, and that was where I lived. I walked toward the elevators, the sound of my heels clicking on the stone. Inside my bag, my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know who it was. It would be texts from my mother. "How could you? We're family. Call us." I ignored it. I had a meeting to get to, and for the first time in my life. I wasn't running to fix their mistakes. I was walking away from them. Most people think hate is a fire that starts with a spark. They think it is an explosion. But in my family, hate was not an explosion. It was an accounting error. It was a slow, creeping calculation that started 17 years ago in a sterile room at Ridgefield General Hospital. And it never really stopped compounding interest. I was 16 years old. The accident itself had been stupid. It was not a dramatic highway pileup. It was a rainy Tuesday, a slick patch of oil on an intersection, and a teenage driver, me, who tapped the brakes a second too late. The car. A rusted sedan my father had bought at an auction for pennies, spun out and clipped a utility pole. The impact was not fast, but the angle was wrong. The steering column collapsed, and my left femur snapped like a dry twig. I remember the pain. Of course, it felt like a hot iron rod being driven through the meat of my thigh. But the pain is not what haunts me. Bones knit, muscles heal. Physical scars fade into silvery lines that you eventually stop noticing in the shower. What haunts me is the conversation I heard when I woke up from the anesthesia. The room was dim. The heart monitor was beeping with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference. My leg was in traction, suspended in the air like a piece of meat in a butcher shop. My throat felt like it was coated in sandpaper. I wanted water. I wanted my mother. I turned my head on the scratchy pillow, ready to ask for help, and I saw them. Dorian and Kendra Mendez were standing by the window. They were not holding hands. They were not looking at me with relief. They were holding a piece of paper, the preliminary estimate of the surgical costs, and they were looking at it with the kind of horror most people reserve for a death notice. "We are ruined," my father said. He did not whisper. He did not check to see if I was awake. He said it with a heavy, flat finality. "The insurance cap is too low," my mother hissed back. "This is going to wipe out the store account. We are going to miss the supplier payment. Dorian, if we miss the supplier payment, they cut off the credit line." "I know," my father snapped. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I told you we shouldn't have put her on the policy. I told you it was a risk." I closed my eyes. I stopped breathing. I lay there, 16 years old, broken and drugged, and I learned the most important lesson of my life. I was not a daughter. I was a liability. I was a line item that had just gone massively over budget. The narrative started before I was even discharged. My parents had been running a small hardware supply business into the ground for 3 years. I knew this later, when I learned how to read tax returns. But at the time, I only knew what they told me. They told everyone that the business was thriving. They told the neighbors we were expanding. But when the hospital bills started arriving, the story changed overnight. Suddenly, the failing business was not the result of my father's gambling habit or my mother's inability to manage inventory. No, the business was failing because of Tara. I became the scapegoat for a decade of financial incompetence. I remember a dinner party about 6 months after the accident. My leg was still in a cast, and I was maneuvering around the dining room on crutches, trying to help clear the table. My aunt was there, and she asked my father how the store was doing. My father took a long sip of his wine he could not afford, and sighed. He pointed his fork at me. "We are hanging on by a thread," he said, his voice dripping with performative martyrdom. "That surgery bled us dry. $30,000 out of pocket. It completely decapitalized the business. But what can you do? She is our daughter. We had to pay it." The room went silent. Everyone looked at me. I felt the heat rise up my neck, burning my cheeks. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say that the surgery cost $12,000, not 30. I wanted to say that the business had been in the red since I was 12, but I didn't. I looked down at my plate. I felt a heavy, crushing guilt settle onto my shoulders. I believed them. I was 16. Parents are gods to their children, even the bad ones. If they said I ruined the family, then I must have ruined the family. I started carrying that guilt like a backpack filled with stones. I walked with a limp, not because of the leg, but because of the weight of my existence. I felt that I owed them for the air I breathed. I felt that every bite of food I ate was taking something away from them. Then came the nickname. It started as a joke. My father was stressed about a utility bill, and I asked for $20 to pay for a school field trip. He looked at me, laughed a dry, humorless laugh, and said, "Another withdrawal from the Leech?" He didn't say it with hate. Not then. He said it casually. But my mother picked it up. When I took a long shower, she would knock on the door and shout, "Water costs money, you little leech." It became their shorthand. It became their way of absolving themselves. If they couldn't pay the mortgage, it was because the leech had braces 3 years ago. If they couldn't afford a vacation, it was because the leech crashed the car. They rewrote the history of our family until every misfortune pointed back to me. And then Blair was born. I was 19 when my sister arrived. My parents called her their fresh start. That was the actual term they used. I remember standing over her crib, looking at her sleeping face, and hearing my mother say to a neighbor, "This one is going to be different. We are going to get it right this time." Blair was the golden child because she had no debt attached to her. She was a blank balance sheet. I watched Blair grow up getting everything I had been denied. When Blair wanted dance lessons, the money miraculously appeared. When Blair wanted brand-name clothes, my mother found a way. When I asked why, the answer was always the same. "We couldn't give you these things, Tara, because we were paying off your medical bills." It was a lie. I know that now. The bills had been paid off years ago. They were using my past tragedy to justify their present favoritism, but at the time, it just reinforced the algorithm in my head. I am the deficit. Blair is the surplus. This dynamic twisted me. It changed the way I related to the world. I decided that the only way to be loved, the only way to be worthy of occupying space in the house, was to pay. I got a job as soon as I could walk without the crutches. I worked at a diner on the edge of town, taking the night shifts that no one else wanted. I smelled like grease and stale coffee. I saved every dollar, every Friday. I would cash my check. I would keep $20 for gas, and I would put the rest in a white envelope. I would leave it on the kitchen counter. I never handed it to them directly. I was too ashamed. I would just leave it there. The next morning, the envelope would be gone. They never said thank you, not once. To say thank you would be to acknowledge that it was a gift. To them, it wasn't a gift. It was a repayment. It was the minimum payment on a loan I had never signed for. I remember one specific night when I was 22. I had been working double shifts for a month. I had saved up $500. I was so proud. I thought, finally, this is enough. This will make them smile. This will make my father look at me the way he looks at Blair. I put the money on the counter. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen. My father was drinking coffee. He looked at me, then looked at the spot where the envelope had been. "The electric bill was $600 this month," he said. He didn't look up from his newspaper. "We are still short." I stood there, feeling my heart crack. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I could work until my hands bled. I could sell my blood. I could sell my soul. And I would still be the reason they were unhappy. That was the moment the ice started to form in my chest. That was the moment I stopped looking for love and started looking for the ledger. I went to my room that night and I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled out a notebook. I started writing things down. I wrote down how much I had given them. I wrote down the cost of the groceries I bought. I wrote down the rent I should have been charged versus the money I contributed. I started to audit my own family. And as I wrote, I started to see the holes in their story. I saw the dates that didn't match. I saw the expenses that made no sense. I saw that during the month they claimed we were starving because of my physical therapy. My father had leased a new truck. I realized that memory is a liar. Emotion is a liar. Guilt is a liar. Only numbers tell the truth. Numbers don't care if you are a good daughter. Numbers don't care if you are sorry. Numbers just are. 2 + 2 = 4. No matter how much your mother cries. That realization pushed me out of the house. It pushed me into college. It pushed me into accounting. I didn't choose this career because I loved math. I chose it because I needed a weapon. I needed a way to defend myself against the fiction my family wrote about me. I moved out. But the damage was done. The reflex was hardwired into my nervous system. Every time I visited, I brought gifts. I paid for dinner. I fixed the roof. I tried to buy my way out of the Leech label, but it didn't work. The more I gave, the more they took, and the more they took, the more they resented me for having it to give. Blair grew up watching this. She learned that Tara was the bank. She learned that Tara was the one who fixed things, but she was also the one to be mocked. Tara is so tight with money, Blair would say at Thanksgiving. Wearing a dress I had paid for, she has no soul. She just cares about her spreadsheets, and my parents would nod. It's true. She has always been cold, ever since the accident. They blamed the accident for everything. They blamed it for their poverty. They blamed it for my personality. They stole the narrative of my trauma and used it to build a cage for me. But there was one person who didn't buy the story. Grandpa Harlan. He was the only one who saw the envelopes on the counter. He was the only one who saw me limping home from the diner at 2 a.m. He never said anything in front of them. He was a quiet man, conflict-averse, beaten down by life in his own way. But he watched. I remember one afternoon, shortly before I left for college, I was sitting on the back porch, going over my tuition calculations, trying to figure out how many loans I would need. Grandpa came out and sat beside me. He smelled of tobacco and peppermint. He looked at my notebook, filled with columns of tiny, precise numbers. "You keep good records, Tara," he said softly. "I have to," I replied, not looking up. "If I don't, I forget what I owe." He was silent for a long time. Then he reached out and covered my hand with his. His skin was like dry paper, warm and fragile. "You don't owe anyone for being alive. Kid," he said, "the only debt you have is to the truth. And let me tell you something about truth. If you don't write it down, the liars will write it for you." I looked at him then. I saw a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. I realized he knew. He knew about the lies. He knew about the money. He knew about the emotional theft that had been taking place under his roof. "Keep the books, Tara," he whispered. "One day, you are going to need them." I didn't understand the full weight of his words then. I thought he was just giving me advice about school. I didn't know he was giving me the blueprint for my survival. 17 years later, sitting in that courtroom, I finally understood. My parents thought they could write the end of this story. They thought they could use the same old eraser they had used my whole life. Tears, guilt, accusations of selfishness. They thought they could paint me as the villain one last time to get what they wanted. But they forgot one thing. The little girl with the broken leg had grown up. The girl who used to leave cash in envelopes hoping for a smile had been replaced by a woman who demanded receipts. I had spent my entire adult life preparing for this moment. Even if I didn't know it, I had been training to be the gatekeeper since the day I realized that my pain was their paycheck. So when Blair called me a leech in front of the judge, it didn't hurt. It didn't sting. It just felt like data. It was an input that confirmed my hypothesis. They hadn't changed. And because they hadn't changed, they had walked right into the machinery I had built. I looked down at my hands in the hallway outside the courtroom. They were steady, no tremors, no urge to reach for my checkbook to make the problem go away. I was done paying for the accident. I was done paying for the business. I was done paying for Blair's delusions. The debt was paid in full, and now it was time for the audit. By the time I was 25, I had stopped waiting tables. I had stopped serving coffee to truckers and started serving reality checks to millionaires. I landed a position at Kestrel Ridge Advisory to the outside world. Kestrel Ridge looks like a boring boutique accounting firm. We have a discreet office in Charlotte, beige carpets, and very quiet receptionists, but we do not do taxes for suburban families. We are crisis consultants. We are the people you call when your CFO disappears with the payroll, or when a disgruntled ex-partner threatens to leak the double books to the IRS. My job title was junior analyst, but my actual job was professional lie detection. Working at Kestrel Ridge was like going to finishing school for cynics. I spent 12 hours a day looking at spreadsheets that were designed to deceive. I learned that there are 1,000 ways to hide a loss. You can inflate inventory. You can capitalize expenses that should be written off. You can create shell companies to buy your own worthless product just to boost quarterly revenue. But the most important thing I learned was how to read the people sitting across the table. I sat in boardrooms with men who were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I watched them weep. I watched them slam their fists on mahogany tables. I watched them pull out photos of their children and beg for leniency. I watched them threaten to jump out of windows. And I learned to ignore all of it. In my line of work, emotion is just a distraction technique. It is a flare thrown up to blind the heat-seeking missile. When a CEO starts crying about how much he loves his employees right after I point out a $3 million hole in the pension fund, he is not sad. He is terrified. He is trying to appeal to my humanity, so I will stop looking at his math. But math has no humanity. Math is binary. It is either there or it is not. This training rewired my brain. It gave me a new lens through which to view my own family. For years, I had been drowning in their drama. I had reacted to every crisis, every tearful phone call from my mother, every angry outburst from my father. I had been a participant in their chaos. Kestrel Ridge taught me to be an auditor of their chaos. Even after I started making good money, real money, 6 figures, with bonuses that allowed me to buy my own condo and drive a car that didn't rattle, I was still secretly funneling cash to Dorian and Kendra. The conditioning was deep. The Leech narrative was still running in the background of my operating system. I paid their rent when the landlord threatened eviction. I paid their health insurance premiums because I was terrified they would get sick and blame me for not saving them again. There was one incident that I never told anyone about, not even Grandpa. My father had gotten involved with a lender who did not operate out of a bank. This was a man who operated out of a strip mall and charged interest rates that were technically illegal. My father had borrowed $10,000 to float the business, but of course, the money had gone into a bad stock tip and a weekend trip to Atlantic City. When the lender started making threats, physical threats, my father called me. He didn't ask for help. He just told me, in a shaking voice, that he was going to lose his kneecaps if he didn't come up with $15,000 by Friday. I paid it. I walked into that strip mall office in a tailored suit, handed over a cashier's check, and made the man sign a document stating the debt was settled in full. I didn't tell my father I made him sign. I just fixed it. I thought that by paying the shark, I was buying my freedom. I thought, surely, this is the one. Surely, after saving him from physical violence, my father will look at me and say, "Thank you, Tara. You are a good daughter." He didn't. 2 weeks later, at a family barbecue, he made a joke about how some people think money makes them better than their parents. He called me an elitist. That was the crack in the dam. I went back to my office that Monday morning. And I did something I should have done years ago. I opened a new file on my secure server. I named it Project Mendez. I decided to treat my parents' finances like a Kestrel Ridge case. I requested their tax returns. I told them I needed them to help them refinance a loan, which was a lie. But they were so desperate for free labor that they handed over boxes of old paperwork without a second thought. I spent 3 nights reconstructing their financial history. I went back 20 years. I dug up the records from the year of my accident. I found the invoices for the hardware store. I found the bank statements. I sat there, in the blue glow of my monitors, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was all a lie. The bankruptcy myth that had defined my entire life was a fabrication. I looked at the profit and loss statements from the year before my accident. The business was already hemorrhaging money. Revenue was down 40%. My father had taken out 2 business loans that he had personally guaranteed, and he was using new credit cards to pay the interest on old credit cards. They were insolvent months before I ever got behind the wheel of that car. Then I pulled up the medical bills. I had always been told the surgery cost a fortune. My parents had thrown numbers around like 50,000 or 100,000. I found the actual settlement letter from the insurance company. The total out-of-pocket cost for my femur surgery, after the deductible and copay, was $3,500. $3,500. I stared at the number until it blurred. That was the price of my guilt. That was the massive debt that had supposedly destroyed their future. They had spent more than that on a new television and a leather sofa set 3 months after I came home from the hospital. I felt a cold, white-hot rage building in my chest. It wasn't the anger of a teenager. It was the fury of a professional who realizes she has been defrauded. They hadn't just blamed me. They had used my accident as a shield. They knew the business was failing because of their own incompetence and laziness. They needed a reason that wasn't, "We are bad at business." They needed a victim story, and I handed it to them on a platter when I crashed that car. We lost the business because of Tara's medical bills. It was the perfect cover. It made them sympathetic figures in the community instead of failed entrepreneurs. It made me the villain, and it guaranteed that I would spend the next decade trying to pay them back for a crime I didn't commit. I closed the file. I didn't scream. I didn't call them. I just sat there in the dark office, listening to the hum of the hard drives, and I let the Leech die. From that moment on, I stopped being their daughter. I became their auditor. I kept the relationship going on the surface. I still went to dinners. I still bought gifts, but I stopped the cash flow. I stopped paying the emergency bills, and I started watching. I watched how they treated Grandpa Harlan. Grandpa was the only asset left in the family. He had a pension from 40 years at the utility company. He had the house on Elm Street, which he had paid off in 1998. He had a savings account that he never touched. My parents and Blair looked at him and saw a retirement plan. They saw a resource to be mined. I looked at him and saw a hostage. Grandpa was 82, and his health was starting to fade. He was sharp as a tack mentally, but his body was betraying him. He needed help with groceries. He needed help with appointments. My parents moved him into the in-law suite of their house for a few months, claiming they wanted to take care of him. Within 6 weeks, I noticed withdrawals from his checking account, $200 here, $500 there. Gas money, my mother said when I asked. Reimbursement for groceries, but I checked the receipts. They were buying steak and wine with his money, and feeding him soup. I went to see him. We sat on the porch, just like we used to. He looked thinner. He looked tired. "They are waiting for me to die. Tara," he said. He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it like a weather report. "Dorian asks me about the will every week. Blair asks if she can have the vintage car." He looked at me, and his eyes were clear. "You are the only one who doesn't ask for anything. You are the only one who brings me coffee without expecting a tip." That was the moment I made the decision. I wasn't going to let them strip mine this man. I wasn't going to let them do to him what they had done to me. "We need to fix this, Grandpa," I said. "We need to protect you." "I don't want to fight," he whispered. "I don't want them screaming at me. They won't scream at you. I promised. I will take the heat, but we need to lock the doors before they take the furniture. I used my network at Kestrel Ridge. I didn't go to a strip mall lawyer. I went to the best estate planning firm in the state. I called a partner I had worked with on a corporate restructuring case. I need a fortress, I told him. I need an irrevocable trust that is tighter than a drum. I need a structure that cannot be pierced by guilt, manipulation, or fake tears. I drove Grandpa to the appointments. I didn't tell my parents. I told them we were going to the cardiologist. I told them we were going to the park, in those meetings. I sat in the corner and said nothing. I let Grandpa speak. I wanted the lawyers to see that this was his will, not mine. I want Tara to handle it, Grandpa told the attorney. Not because I love her more, although I do, but because she knows how to say no. The rest of them, they have holes in their pockets. We set up the trust. We moved the house. We moved the accounts. We set up the Stonegate fiduciary mandate. But I knew that wasn't enough. I knew my family. I knew that the moment he died, they would scream, undue influence. They would claim I kidnapped him. They would claim I brainwashed him, so I started my own defense file. This was where my Kestrel Ridge training turned into a weapon of war. I started the care log. I bought a thick black binder. Every time I went to see Grandpa, I logged the time. I logged what we ate. I logged his mood. But more importantly, I logged them. I created a digital archive of their neglect. When Blair posted a photo on Instagram of herself at a beach party on the same day, she told Grandpa she was too sick to visit him in the hospital. I screenshot it, I time-stamped it, I printed it out. When my father sent an email asking Grandpa for a short-term loan of $5,000 because of a payroll error, I saved the email. I also saved the public records showing he had just bought a new set of golf clubs that same week. I recorded phone calls. In North Carolina, you only need one party's consent to record a conversation. I was that party. I recorded my mother screaming at me because I wouldn't give her the code to Grandpa's debit card. I recorded Blair admitting that she didn't want to hang out with old people because it was depressing. I gathered 5 years of data. I had tracking numbers for packages they claimed they sent but never arrived. I had logs of unanswered calls. I wasn't building a scrapbook. I was building an indictment. I knew that one day I would be sitting in a courtroom. I knew they would wear black and cry on cue. I knew they would point fingers and call me a monster. And I knew that I would not have to say a word, because I had the receipts. I looked at Grandpa one afternoon, about 3 months before he passed. He was sitting in his favorite chair, looking out at the bird feeder. The trust was signed. The house was secure. "You think they will hate you for this," he said, not looking at me. "They already hate me," I replied. "This just gives them a reason that is actually true, instead of the one they invented." He smiled. It was a dry, sad smile. "You turned out tough. Tara, I am sorry you had to—" "I am not sorry," I said, and I meant it. Tough is safe. I drove home that night, and for the first time in 17 years, I didn't feel the weight of the invisible backpack. I felt light. I felt dangerous. I was no longer the girl who crashed the car. I was the woman who was driving the bus, and I knew exactly where the route ended. The silence that followed the reading of the no contest clause was fragile. It was the kind of silence that exists in the split second after a glass is knocked off a table, right before it shatters on the floor. Blair stared at the document in the judge's hand. Her brain was processing the math. 0. That was the number Arthur Prosser had just put on the table. If she fought the trust, she got 0. If she walked away, she presumably got whatever allocation Grandpa had left her, although knowing Blair, she had already spent that amount in her head 10 times over. But panic is a strange chemical. It does not make people rational. It makes them double down. Blair looked at Sterling. Her lawyer was already packing up his mental briefcase, ready to cut his losses. He knew that a no-contest clause drafted by a firm like the one Prosser represented was ironclad. He was calculating his unpaid billable hours. "Do something," Blair hissed. It wasn't a request. It was a vibration that seemed to shake the table. "Blair, we need to regroup," Sterling whispered, leaning in close. "The clause is specific. If we challenge the validity of the trust without probable cause, you lose your standing. We should retreat, and—" "No!" Blair screamed. The sound tore through the courtroom. It wasn't the polished, theatrical sob she had used earlier. This was the raw, ugly screech of an entitled child being told the toy store was closed. "He was crazy!" Blair shouted, pointing a finger at the empty witness chair where Arthur Prosser had been standing moments ago. "You can't enforce a contract signed by a crazy person. He didn't know what he was doing. Look at the date. October. He was barely lucid in October." Sterling closed his eyes for a second, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He knew what was happening. His client was driving the car off the cliff, and she was dragging him into the passenger seat. "Your Honor," Sterling said, standing up slowly, forced by his client's outburst to pivot. "What my client is trying to express, albeit emotionally, is that we have serious concerns regarding the capacity of the decedent at the time this trust was executed." "He didn't know his own name half the time," Blair interrupted, breathless. "Tara controlled everything. She told him what to sign. She held the pen for him. That is not a trust. That is fraud." Judge Calloway lowered the document. He looked at Blair with the weary patience of a man who had raised 3 teenagers. "Ms. Mendez, you are treading on very dangerous ground. You are now moving from a petition for probate to a direct attack on the validity of the instrument. Are you aware that this triggers the very clause you are afraid of? Unless you can prove undue influence or lack of capacity with clear and convincing evidence?" "We can prove it," my father said. Dorian Mendez stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a nervous tic he had whenever he was about to lie. He walked to the railing that separated the gallery from the court, looking like a man carrying a heavy burden of truth. "Your Honor," my father said, his voice thick with synthetic grief, "I did not want to bring this up. I wanted to protect my father's dignity, but if we are talking about reality, we need to talk about what happened last Christmas." I sat perfectly still. I felt Arthur Prosser shift slightly in the seat next to me, but I didn't look at him. I looked at my watch. 11:10. "Please proceed." "Mr. Mendez," the judge said, "we went to the house on Christmas Eve," my father began. He turned slightly to face the gallery, playing to the audience. "It was our tradition. We brought gifts. We brought food. We just wanted to be a family. But when we got there, the lights were off. The doors were bolted." He paused for effect. My mother, Kendra, let out a soft, strangulated sob behind him. "We knocked," Dorian continued, his voice trembling. "We knocked for an hour. It was freezing outside. We knew they were in there. I saw my father's silhouette in the window. He was sitting in his wheelchair, looking out at us. He looked terrified. He looked like a prisoner. He was crying," my mother added. She couldn't help herself. She had to join the scene. She stood up next to my father, clutching her tissue like a prop. "I saw him, Your Honor. I saw my father crying in the window, reaching his hand out to the glass. He wanted to let us in. I know he did. But then," she pointed a shaking finger at me. "Then she pulled the curtains. She just walked up, looked us right in the eye, and pulled the curtains shut. She left her own parents standing in the snow on Christmas Eve." A gasp went through the courtroom. I could feel the eyes on me. It was a horrific image, the loving family standing in the cold, the cruel granddaughter locking them out, the dying old man trapped inside. It was Dickensian. It was perfect. "That is undue influence, Your Honor," Sterling said, seizing the narrative. He saw an opening. If he could paint me as a monster, he might be able to override the trust. "That is isolation. That is the definition of elder abuse. A man who is locked in his own home, prevented from seeing his children, is not a man who has the capacity to sign away his fortune freely. He signed that trust because he was afraid of her. He signed it because he was a hostage." Blair was nodding vigorously. She threatened him. I heard her once. I called the house, and I heard her screaming at him in the background, telling him that if he didn't do what she said, she would put him in a home. She said she would leave him there to rot. The story was growing. It was taking on a life of its own. It started with a locked door, and within 30 seconds, it had morphed into threats of abandonment and psychological torture. Judge Calloway looked disturbed, even for a seasoned judge. These were heavy accusations. "Ms. Mendez," he said, turning his gaze to me, "these are incredibly serious allegations. We are moving beyond financial disputes into the realm of criminal conduct. Do you have a response?" I looked at the judge. Then I looked at my parents. I needed them to commit. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, contrasting sharply with the hysteria on the other side of the aisle. "I want to be very clear about what is being stated for the record. The petitioners are claiming that on December 24th of last year, they were physically present at the residence on Elm Street. They are claiming they saw the decedent in the window, and they are claiming they witnessed me physically closing the curtains to bar their entry." "We saw it," my mother cried out. I will never forget the look in his eyes. "And you are claiming," I continued, ignoring her and keeping my eyes on the judge, "that Blair Mendez heard me threaten to put the decedent in a nursing home during a phone call. Can you specify the date of that call?" It was in November," Blair stammered, caught off guard by the request for specifics. "Early November, right after Thanksgiving. I called to check on him, and you picked up, and I heard you screaming. Early November," I repeated. "And Christmas Eve, December 24th. "Yes," Blair shouted. "Stop trying to confuse things with dates. The point is you are an abuser." Sterling stepped forward. Sensing that the emotional momentum was peaking, he decided to go for the kill. "Your Honor," Sterling boomed, "based on this testimony, based on the eyewitness accounts of 3 family members who have described a pattern of isolation, coercion, and psychological abuse, we are formally requesting that the powers of the trustee be suspended immediately. We are requesting a court-appointed guardian ad litem to investigate the circumstances of the trust's creation, and we are asking for an immediate freezing of all assets pending a full investigation into elder abuse." The words elder abuse hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sterling looked triumphant. He thought he had found the magic words in probate court. Elder abuse is the nuclear launch code. It stops everything. It overrides contracts. It pierces trusts. It is the one accusation that forces the court to pause and look, because no judge wants to be the one who handed a fortune to a predator. My parents looked at each other. They saw the shift in the judge's face. They saw the hesitation. They thought they had won. They thought that by painting me as a villain, they had unlocked the vault. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair. He looked at Arthur Prosser. "Mr. Prosser, in light of these accusations, the court is inclined to grant a temporary stay. If the grantor was indeed acting under duress or lacked capacity due to isolation, the trust could be voidable." Arthur Prosser didn't speak. He just turned his head and looked at me. It was a small movement, a microscopic transfer of authority. I sat there for 1 heartbeat, 2, then I nodded. It wasn't a frantic nod. It was the sharp, downward chin movement of a demolition expert pressing the plunger. Arthur Prosser reached down to the floor. He picked up a second briefcase, one I had brought with me, but which he had kept under the table. He placed it on the desk. It made a heavy thud, distinct from the sound of the envelope earlier. This sounded like a brick. He clicked the latches open. Snap, snap. He didn't pull out a single document this time. He pulled out a binder. It was 4 inches thick, black, reinforced corners. The spine had a white label that read simply, CareLog/Communications/Security-2021 to 2026. He didn't hand it to the clerk. He held it up, allowing the spine to be visible to the entire room. "Your Honor," Prosser said, his voice cutting through the emotional haze like a laser. "Before you rule on the motion for a stay based on the testimony of the petitioners, the trustee would like to submit Exhibit B." "What is that?" Sterling asked. his voice losing a fraction of its confidence. "This," Prosser said, "is a comprehensive, contemporaneous record of Harlan Mendez's life for the past 5 years. It contains daily logs from his visiting nurses. It contains GPS data. It contains call logs subpoenaed from the telecommunications provider, and it contains security footage metadata." My mother stopped crying. She froze, the tissue halfway to her eyes. "You mentioned a specific incident on Christmas Eve," Prosser said, turning to look directly at my father. "You stated, under oath, that you stood on the porch and saw Mr. Mendez in the window." Prosser opened the binder. He didn't fumble. He turned to a tab marked December. "I am looking at the log for December 24th, Prosser read. "According to the shift report from Mrs. Higgins, the night nurse, Mr. Harlan Mendez was not at the Elm Street residence on Christmas Eve." The room went dead silent. "He was, in fact," Prosser continued, "admitted to Ridgefield General Hospital for a precautionary observation regarding a mild arrhythmia. He was admitted at 2 p.m. and was not discharged until 10 a.m. on December 26th. I watched the color drain from my father's face. It didn't fade. It vanished, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under heat. "Furthermore," Prosser said, flipping a page, "we have the security camera footage from the Ring doorbell at the Elm Street residence for the entire night of December 24th. It shows an empty porch. No one knocked. No one stood in the snow. The motion sensors were not triggered once between the hours of 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. Blair gasped. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "So," Prosser said, looking up at the judge, "unless Mr. Mendez has the ability to see through walls into a hospital room 5 miles away, or unless he has the ability to be invisible to infrared cameras. His testimony regarding the events of Christmas Eve is factually impossible." Judge Calloway looked at my father. His expression had changed from concern to something much colder. It was the look of a man who realized his court was being used as a stage for a bad fiction. "Mr. Mendez," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, "did you just lie to this court?" I might have confused the year," my father stammered, sweat beading instantly on his forehead. "Maybe it was the year before." "And the phone call?" Prosser interrupted. Relentless. He turned to another tab. "Ms. Blair Mendez testified she heard screaming in early November. We have the call logs here. In the month of November, there were 0 incoming calls from Blair Mendez's number to Harlan Mendez's landline or cell phone." He held up a page covered in highlighted rows. "In fact," Prosser said, "the last recorded incoming call from Blair Mendez was on February 14th, 2024. That is nearly 2 years ago. The call lasted 18 seconds. It went to voicemail. There was no callback." Blair shrank into her seat. She looked like she wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. "This binder," Prosser said, slamming it shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot, "does not contain evidence of isolation, Your Honor. It contains evidence of abandonment. It proves that the only people who isolated Harlan Mendez were the people sitting at that table. They didn't call. They didn't visit. And now, they are inventing a history to justify their greed." I sat there, my hands folded. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I could hear their story crumbling, brick by brick. Sterling looked at the binder, then at his clients. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in a minefield without a map. He slowly sat down, putting a significant distance between himself and Blair. "Ms. Mendez," the judge said to me, "is this accurate? Was your grandfather in the hospital on Christmas Eve?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said softly. "I have the discharge papers in the appendix if you wish to see them. I spent Christmas Eve sleeping in the chair next to his bed. My family was invited. I sent them a group text at 3 p.m., informing them of his admission. It was marked read by all 3 of them. No one replied." The judge stared at the plaintiffs. His eyes were hard. "We are done with the elder abuse theory," Judge Calloway said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Mr. Sterling, Unless you have evidence that isn't a fabrication that can be disproven by a doorbell camera, I suggest you sit down and stay down. The trap had not just sprung, it had taken their legs off, but I wasn't done. The binder had more pages, and we hadn't even gotten to the part where they owed money. I looked at my watch, 11:20, right on schedule. Arthur Prosser did not close the binder, he simply turned the page. The sound of the heavy paper turning was the only noise in the courtroom, a dry, crisp sound that signaled the end of one chapter and the beginning of an even darker one. "Your Honor," Prosser said, his tone shifting from defensive to prosecutorial. "We have established that the plaintiffs lied about the events of last Christmas, but their argument rests on a broader foundation. They claim Ms. Tara Mendez isolated the decedent. They claim she built a wall around him to keep them out. We are now going to examine the bricks of that alleged wall." He pulled a second, thinner volume from his briefcase. This one was spiral-bound with a clear plastic cover. "Exhibit C," Prosser announced. "The Medical and Care Administration log." He walked it over to the judge's bench. "This log contains every single interaction Harlan Mendez had with healthcare professionals for the last 36 months of his life," Prosser explained. "It lists every dose of medication, every blood pressure reading, and every meal, but more importantly, it lists the visitors." The judge opened the log. "If you look at the visitor column," Prosser continued, "you will see Ms. Tara Mendez's name listed 412 times. You will see the visiting nurses listed daily. You will see his physical therapist. Now, I would ask the court to count the number of times the names Dorian, Kendra, or Blair Mendez appear in that column for the entire year of 2024. Judge Calloway ran his finger down the long, spreadsheet-style list. He flipped a page, then another. He looked up, his face unreadable. "0, the judge said. "0, Prosser repeated. "Not one visit, not one check-in with the nurse, not one inquiry to the doctor. If Ms. Mendez was isolating him, she was doing a terrible job of it, because there was no one trying to get in." "We called!" Blair shrieked from her seat. She looked desperate now, her makeup smeared, her posture collapsing. "We called him all the time. She blocked our numbers. She took his phone away." Prosser didn't even look at her. He just nodded to himself, as if he had expected exactly this outburst. "Exhibit D," Prosser said, producing a stack of stapled papers. "The telecommunications audit." He held the papers up for the room to see. They were thick with rows of data. "We subpoenaed the records for Harlan Mendez's landline and personal cell phone," Prosser said. "Ms. Blair Mendez claims her calls were blocked. However, the carrier logs show no blocked numbers. What they do show is a pattern of outgoing calls." Prosser walked to the witness stand, placed the papers down, and pointed to a highlighted section. "October 12th, 2023, Prosser read. "This was Blair Mendez's 26th birthday. At 10 in the morning, Harlan Mendez placed a call to your mobile number. It lasted 45 seconds. The carrier data identifies this as a voicemail deposit. There was no return call that day. There was no return call the next day. In fact, there was no return call for 3 weeks." Blair's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "June 16th, 2024, Prosser continued. Flipping the page, Father's Day, at 9 a.m., Harlan Mendez sent a text message to the group chat labeled Family. The text read, "Are you coming by today? I have the grill ready. We have the read receipts here. All 3 of you open the message within 10 minutes. Prosser paused. He let the date hang in the air. Father's Day, the day every Hallmark card says you are supposed to care. No one replied, Prosser said. No one showed up. The grill remained cold. The nurse's notes from that day indicate that Mr. Mendez ate a sandwich alone in his kitchen and went to bed at 6 p.m. because he was, quote, feeling tired of waiting. My mother let out a gasp. It was a genuine sound this time, the sound of shame piercing through the layers of her denial. She put a hand over her mouth. This is not isolation, Prosser said. his voice dropping to a register that was almost dangerously quiet. "This is ghosting. You didn't disappear because Tara locked you out. You disappeared because he was old. He was boring to you, and he wasn't dying fast enough to be interesting." Sterling was rubbing his forehead. He wasn't objecting anymore. He was watching his case dissolve into a puddle of digital evidence. "But we didn't know," my father blurted out. He was grasping at straws, trying to find a narrative that didn't make him look like a monster. "We didn't know about the appointments. Tara kept everything secret. She controlled the information flow." "I am glad you brought that up," Prosser said. "Exhibit E." He pulled out a folder of printed emails. "Ms. Tara Mendez is a professional analyst," Prosser said. "She does not do things by verbal agreement. She creates paper trails. This file contains copies of every single medical update, appointment schedule, and emergency contact form regarding Harlan Mendez for the last 5 years." He handed a copy to Sterling. Sterling took it like it was radioactive. "You will note," Prosser said, "that every single email is addressed to the family group distribution list. You will see the timestamp. You will see the subject lines: cardiology update, hospital admission, Thanksgiving plans, and thanks to the tracking pixel embedded in the email client Ms. Mendez uses, we also have the open rates." Prosser turned to the judge. "Your Honor, on average, the petitioners opened less than 10% of the emails regarding the decedent's health. However, on the rare occasion Ms. Mendez sent an email with the subject line regarding gift money or distribution, the open rate was 100% within 5 minutes. A ripple of laughter went through the back of the courtroom. It wasn't happy laughter. It was the shocked, cynical laughter of strangers realizing just how low these people were. My father sank into his seat. He looked small. The confused, loving son act was dead. The data had killed it. "But," Prosser said, and the word hung there like a guillotine blade, "we have one final piece of evidence regarding the claim of fear and hostility." He walked back to the table and picked up a USB drive. He walked it over to the court clerk. "You mentioned earlier that you were locked out on Christmas Eve," Prosser said, addressing the room but looking at the judge. "We established that was a lie regarding last year. However, there was an incident on December 24th. It was just 2 years ago, in 2023, and I think it is important for the court to see why the security protocols were increased after that night." The clerk plugged the drive into the court's projection system. A large screen on the side wall flickered to life. The timestamp on the video read, December 24th, 2023, 11:42 p.m. The video was from the Ring doorbell camera. It was high definition, crisp and clear, showing the front porch of the house on Elm Street. The frame was empty for a second, and then 3 figures stumbled into view. It was my family. They were not the somber, grieving people sitting in the courtroom today. They were dressed in party clothes. My mother was wearing a sequined dress that was slipping off her shoulder. My father was holding a bottle of wine by the neck. Blair was wearing a Santa hat that was crooked. They were visibly, sloppily intoxicated. "Open up!" The voice on the video was my father's, but it was slurred and aggressive. He pounded on the door with his fist. Thud, thud, thud. "Come on, Dad!" my mother yelled, her voice screeching. "We know you're in there. Give us the check. You promised the Christmas check." "Tara!" Blair screamed in the video, leaning close to the camera lens so her face was distorted and fish-eyed. "I know you're in there. You bitch! Open the door. We want our money." In the courtroom, Blair covered her face with her hands. My mother looked down at her lap, her face burning a deep, blotchy red. On the screen, the pounding continued. My father kicked the door. It was a violent, angry kick. Then, the audio picked up a sound from inside the house. It was faint, but audible. "Please," a voice said. It was Grandpa. "Please go away. You're scaring me." "I don't care if you're scared," my father roared on the video. "I care that I have bills to pay. Open the damn door or I will break it down." Then, the video cut to a split screen. On the right side, a transcript appeared. This is the log of a 911 call placed from the landline inside the house at 11:45 p.m., Prosser narrated. The audio played. 911, what is your emergency? They are trying to break in. Grandpa's voice was shaking, breathless. My son, he's drunk. He's kicking the door. I think the frame is cracking. Please, my chest hurts. Sir, are you alone? No, Grandpa whispered. Tara is holding the door. She's holding it shut with her body. Please hurry. Then there was a loud crash on the audio, followed by the line going dead. Prosser paused the playback. The courtroom was frozen. It was a silence so heavy it felt like it had mass. The call was interrupted, Prosser said quietly, because Mr. Mendez collapsed. He went into atrial fibrillation from the stress. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. They found Tara Mendez performing CPR on her grandfather, while her father, the man sitting right there, was arguing with the police officers on the lawn about his right to enter the property. Judge Calloway slowly turned his head. He looked at my father. There was no judicial neutrality left in his eyes. There was only the cold, hard glare of a man looking at something that had crawled out from under a rock. You told this court, the judge said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, that you were a loving family who was rejected. You told this court that she was the abuser. My father tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to fail him. Your Honor, it was a misunderstanding. We had been at a party. Sit down, the judge snapped. It wasn't a request. It was an order given to a dog. This evidence, Prosser concluded, pulling the USB drive out, demonstrates why the trust was created. It demonstrates why the no contest clause was essential. Harlan Mendez wasn't protecting his money from the government. He wasn't protecting it from taxes. He was protecting himself from them. Prosser sat down. I sat perfectly still. I didn't look at Blair. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the judge. The narrative they had built, the story of the poor, excluded family and the cold, calculating sister, had not just been disproven, it had been atomized. The data had stripped them naked. They weren't victims. They were the villains in a horror movie, caught on tape. Sterling closed his folder. He didn't even look at Blair. He signaled to the judge with a small hand gesture that said, clearly, I am done. I have nothing. The judge looked at me. For the first time all morning. His eyes were soft. He wasn't looking at a defendant. He was looking at the granddaughter who had held the door shut. Ms. Mendez, the judge said softly, the court thanks you for your diligence in record-keeping. I nodded once. It is what he asked me to do, Your Honor. The playback screen went black, but the image of my father kicking that door remained burned into the retina of everyone in the room. The air had changed. The family drama was over. Now, it was just a sentencing. The courtroom was quiet, but it was the silence of a tomb, not a library. The air smelled of stale sweat and expensive perfume turning sour on panicked skin. The video of my father kicking the door had ended, but the image seemed to be burned into the retina of everyone present. Sterling, Blair's lawyer, looked like a man who was trying to calculate the exact velocity at which his career was currently hitting a brick wall. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that was no longer crisp. He had one card left to play. It was a weak card, a desperate card. But it was the only thing standing between his client and total annihilation. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice lacking the boom it had possessed an hour ago. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at his notes, shuffling them pointlessly. While the video is unfortunate, and the telecommunications data is compelling regarding the social dynamic, none of this addresses the core legal issue of capacity. He looked up, trying to regain some semblance of professional posture. Mr. Harlan Mendez was 91 years old, Sterling argued. He was battling stage 4 heart failure. He was on a cocktail of palliative medications, including heavy opioids for pain management. The defense has shown us a video of him being scared. Yes, but fear is not capacity. A man can be terrified and still be legally incompetent to understand the complex nature of an irrevocable trust document. We submit that the chemicals in his bloodstream rendered him pliable, confused, and unable to comprehend that he was signing away his autonomy. Blair nodded vigorously next to him. She grabbed onto this lifeline with both hands. "Yes," she cried out, her voice cracking. He was on morphine. He slept 18 hours a day. How could he understand a 40-page legal contract? Tara just shoved papers in front of him when he was high. I sat still. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't sigh. I just tapped my pen against the table once. Arthur Prosser didn't even bother to stand up this time. He just reached into the second briefcase again. "Exhibit F," Prosser said calmly. "The affidavit of capacity and independent review." He slid a thick-bound document across the table to the clerk. "Mr. Sterling brings up a valid medical concern," Prosser said, his voice smooth and deadly, "which is exactly why Ms. Mendez and the estate planning attorneys anticipated it. We did not rely on a standard notary. We did not rely on a general practitioner." Prosser pointed to the document. On the morning of October 14th, 3 hours before the trust was signed, Mr. Harlan Mendez was evaluated by 2 separate, independent medical professionals. The first was Dr. Aris Thorne, a board-certified neurologist. The second was Dr. Ellen Gabler, a forensic geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in testamentary capacity disputes. Sterling froze. A forensic psychiatrist? That was the nuclear option of estate planning. You don't bring in a forensic psychiatrist unless you are expecting a war. Both doctors interviewed the decedent separately for 1 hour each, Prosser continued. They administered the mini-mental state examination. They administered the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. They reviewed his medication logs to ensure he had not taken any opioids for 12 hours prior to the meeting to ensure absolute clarity of mind. Prosser turned a page in the document. Both doctors signed sworn affidavits stating that Harlan Mendez was fully oriented to time, place, and person. They stated that he possessed a sophisticated understanding of his assets. And most importantly, they stated that he was acting under his own volition, free from duress, and was driven by a specific, articulate desire to protect his legacy. Blair's face was a mask of horror. She looked at her lawyer. But he was old," she whispered, as if age alone was a legal argument. "And," Prosser said, raising a finger, "because we knew that paper affidavits can be challenged as dry and impersonal, we took one additional step." He looked at the clerk. "If you could please play the file labeled Interview B4. The screen on the wall flickered again. This was not the grainy, night vision footage of the doorbell camera. This was high-quality video, shot in a well-lit conference room with wood paneling. The timestamp was October 14th, 2025, 10 in the morning. Grandpa was sitting at the head of a table. He was wearing his best suit, the navy blue one he used to wear to church. He looked frail. Yes. His skin was translucent, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. But his eyes were sharp. They were the blue steel eyes I remembered from my childhood. Before the sickness took hold, a voice from off-camera, Dr. Gabler, spoke. "Mr. Mendez, can you tell us why we are here today?" Grandpa looked directly at the camera lens. He didn't stutter. He didn't look confused. "We are here to sign the trust documents," Grandpa said. His voice was raspy, but clear. "And can you explain, in your own words, what this trust does?" "It moves my house and my money out of my name," Grandpa said. "It puts them under the care of a trustee. It means I don't own them anymore. The trust owns them." "And why do you want to do that, Harlan?" the doctor asked gently. "Why not leave it to your children in a standard will?" Grandpa leaned forward. The camera zoomed in slightly on his face. "Because a will is a suggestion," Grandpa said. "And my family doesn't listen to suggestions." He took a breath. I watched my father in the courtroom flinch as if he had been slapped. "My son, Dorian, has a gambling problem he calls an investment strategy," Grandpa said on the video. "My daughter-in-law thinks affection is something you buy," And my granddaughter, Blair. He paused. He looked sad for a moment, a flash of genuine grief crossing his face. Blair thinks I am an automated teller machine, Grandpa said. She thinks love is a transaction. She only calls when her credit card is maxed out. I do not want my life's work to become their next mistake. I do not want my house to be sold to pay for a business that has been dead for 20 years. I want to protect what is left. Has anyone forced you to say this? The doctor asked. Has your granddaughter Tara threatened you? Grandpa laughed. It was a dry, rasping chuckle. Tara, he said. Tara is the only reason I still have a roof over my head. She didn't threaten me. I begged her to help me. I begged her to build the wall because I was too tired to hold the door shut myself. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a total, catastrophic defeat. Blair was shaking. She wasn't crying anymore. She was vibrating with a mix of rage and terror. She realized that her own lawsuit, which claimed he was incompetent, had just been used to prove exactly why he had cut her out. She had walked into the courtroom claiming he was a zombie, and he had just spoken from the grave to call her a gold digger. Sterling looked defeated. He started to close his briefcase, but then, a thought seemed to occur to him, a desperate, final grasp at a straw. Your Honor, Sterling said weakly, this is compelling, but we must ask about the provenance of these experts. Who paid for them? Who hired Dr. Gabler? Who hired Dr. Thorne? He pointed a shaking finger at me. If Tara Mendez paid for these favorable opinions, Sterling said, his voice gaining a shred of momentum, then this is just purchased testimony. It is a conflict of interest. She bought the doctors to certify the results she wanted. It was a standard move. Attack the funding. If the beneficiary pays the doctor is suspect. I looked at Arthur Prosser. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. We anticipated this objection as well, Prosser said, sounding almost bored by the predictability of the opposition. Exhibit G. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a cashier's check. Ms. Mendez did not pay the doctors, Prosser said. Ms. Mendez did not pay the estate attorneys. Ms. Mendez did not even pay the notary fee. He handed the paper to the judge. This is a cashier's check, drawn on the personal checking account of Harlan Mendez. Dated October 1st, 2025. The memo line reads, Legal and Medical Retainer. The signature is Harlan Mendez's. We have the bank teller's affidavit that Mr. Mendez came into the branch personally, answered the security questions, and requested the check himself. Prosser turned to Sterling. He paid for his own defense. Counselor, Tara Mendez merely drove the car. The money, the intent, and the execution were 100% Harlan Mendez. There is no conflict of interest because the beneficiary did not spend a dime. Sterling stared at the paper. The air went out of him completely. He slumped into his chair. A man who realized he had been outplayed not by a lawyer, but by an accountant who knew that the paper trail is the only god that matters in a courtroom. Judge Calloway took off his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted, not physically, but spiritually. He had spent the morning listening to a family try to destroy a young woman, only to find out that the young woman was the only adult in the room. Mr. Sterling, the judge said. His voice was low. Dangerous. You filed an emergency motion alleging elder abuse. You filed a motion alleging incapacity. You dragged this woman's reputation through the mud in a public court of law. Your Honor, we believed, Sterling started. You believed what your clients told you without checking a single fact, the judge snapped. You didn't check the hospital records. You didn't check the phone logs. And you clearly didn't check the capacity affidavits, which were filed with the original trust documents in the county clerk's office, which you could have accessed for $5. The judge looked at Blair and my parents. This court finds the testimony of the petitioners to be not only unreliable but bordering on perjury. The evidence submitted by the trustee is overwhelming and irrefutable. He banged his gavel. It wasn't a loud bang. It was a final bang. The motion for emergency control is denied. The motion to remove the trustee is denied with prejudice, meaning you cannot bring it up again. The judge leaned forward. Furthermore, I am setting a hearing for 2 weeks from today to consider Rule 11 sanctions against the plaintiffs and their counsel for filing frivolous pleadings lacking evidentiary support. I am also forwarding the transcript of today's hearing regarding the events of Christmas Eve to the District Attorney's Office for review regarding potential perjury charges. My father gasped. My mother grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with terror. They had come here to get money. Now they were facing fines and potential criminal charges. And finally, the judge said, picking up the trust document again, we return to Article 9, the No Contest Clause. Blair made a sound like a wounded animal. No, she whispered. Please. The language is clear, Judge Calloway said, reading from the page. If any beneficiary seeks to invalidate any provision of this instrument in any court of law, he looked at Blair. You sought to invalidate the trust by claiming incapacity. You sought to invalidate the trustee's appointment. You have triggered the clause. Ms. Mendez, by filing this lawsuit, you have legally disinherited yourself. But I didn't mean to, Blair screamed, standing up. I just wanted my share. It's not fair. He's my grandfather. He was your grandfather, the judge corrected her cold. Now, he is a grantor, and you are a stranger to this trust. Your Honor, Prosser said, standing up, the trust accepts the court's ruling. We will immediately zero out the accounts allocated to Blair, Dorian, and Kendra Mendez, and redistribute those funds to the secondary beneficiaries as mandated by the instrument. So ordered, the judge said. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down. The sound echoed off the wood paneling. It was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. I watched Blair. She stood there, swaying slightly. The reality was crashing down on her. She hadn't just lost the lawsuit. She hadn't just lost the potential inheritance. She had lost the safety net she had been relying on her entire life. She had spent money she didn't have, banking on a payday that she just incinerated with her own signature on the complaint. My parents sat like statues. My father was staring at his hands. He knew what was coming. He knew about the promissory notes. He knew about the debts. He knew that without this money, the house of cards he had built was going to collapse within 30 days. Sterling was already packing his bag. He wasn't looking at his clients. He was looking at the exit. He knew he wasn't getting paid. He knew he was about to face a sanctions hearing that could damage his license. He wanted to be anywhere but here. I slowly stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I picked up my bag. I looked at Arthur Prosser. Thank you, Mr. Prosser, I said quietly. Just doing the job. Miss Mendez, he replied, snapping his briefcase shut. I will be in touch regarding the transfer of the remaining assets. I turned to leave. I had to walk past them to get to the door. Blair looked up at me. Her eyes were red, swollen, and full of a hate so pure it was almost impressive. You planned this, she hissed. You let me do it. You knew if I sued, I would lose everything, and you let me do it. I stopped. I looked down at her. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a ledger that finally balanced. I didn't let you do anything, Blair, I said. I just didn't stop you. I walked past her, past the weeping mother, past the stunned father. I walked toward the heavy wooden doors. The leech was gone. The victim was gone. The auditor was leaving the building, and she was the only one walking out with a future. The parking lot of the Ridgefield County Courthouse was a sprawling expanse of cracked asphalt, baking under the midday sun. Heat radiated off the parked cars, creating shimmering mirages that distorted the air. It was a harsh, unforgiving light, the kind that exposes every flaw, every wrinkle, and every lie. I stepped out of the air-conditioned building and felt the humidity hit me like a physical blow. I adjusted my sunglasses, gripped the handle of my bag, and started walking toward my car. A sensible, mid-range sedan parked in row C. I heard them before I saw them. Tara, wait! It was my father's voice. Gone was the theatrical baritone he had used in the courtroom. Gone was the aggressive roar from the doorbell video. This was the voice he used when the creditors were on the line. It was high, breathless, and laced with a frantic, desperate charm. I didn't stop walking. My heels clicked a steady rhythm on the pavement. Clack, clack, clack. Tara, please! My mother's voice joined in, shrill and weeping. Don't just walk away. We need to talk. I reached my car. I beeped the unlock button. As I reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed my arm. I spun around, not in fear, but in a cold, controlled reflex. I pulled my arm back sharply. Breaking the contact, it was my father. He was sweating profusely. His tie was loosened, hanging like a noose around his neck. His face was blotchy, a map of high blood pressure and panic. Don't touch me, I said. My voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the distant highway. But it stopped him in his tracks. We just want to talk, he panted, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Just for a minute. Look, what happened in there? It got out of hand. The lawyers, they push you to say things, you know? They twist things. The lawyers didn't make you kick the door. Dad, I said, looking him straight in the eye. And the lawyers didn't make you ignore Grandpa for 2 years. That was a misunderstanding, my mother wailed, pushing past him. She reached out as if to hug me, but I took a step back. She froze, her arms empty. We were busy. Tara, you know how the business is. We were trying to survive. We were doing it for the family. The family, I repeated. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Yes, us. My mother gestured wildly between herself, Dorian, and Blair, who was trailing behind them, looking like a storm cloud in heels. We are your family. Tara, you can't let them do this to us. You can't let that bank man take everything. It's not right. It's Grandpa's money. It belongs to us. It belonged to him, I corrected. And now it belongs to the trust. That's how ownership works. Blair finally caught up. She wasn't crying anymore. She had moved past grief into the bargaining stage of grief, but she was doing it with the aggression of someone who had never been told no. You need to fix this, Blair snapped. She stepped into my personal space, smelling of sweat and expensive vanilla perfume. You need to go back in there and tell the judge it was a mistake. Tell him we were emotional. Tell him we didn't mean to contest the trust. If you tell him, he'll listen. You're the golden girl now, right? I can't tell a judge to ignore the law, Blair, I said calmly, and I can't tell a trustee to ignore a contract. Yes, you can, Blair shouted. You're the one who set it up. You know the loopholes. You always have a plan. Just tell them we worked it out. We can split it, okay? We'll split it. 3 ways. You, me, Mom and Dad. That's fair. Grandpa would have wanted it to be fair. I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. 10 minutes ago, she was accusing me of elder abuse. Now, she was offering me 1/3 of the money she had just tried to steal entirely. He didn't want it to be fair, I said. He wanted it to be safe. Tara, listen to me, my father interrupted, stepping between us. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, the tone he used when he was asking for a short-term loan. We are in trouble, real trouble. The mortgage is 3 months behind. The suppliers are threatening to sue. We were counting on this. If we don't get this distribution, we lose the house. We lose everything. He looked at me with those puppy dog eyes that had worked on me for 20 years. The eyes that said, I am helpless. Save me. You're the smart one, he said. You're the fixer. Fix it, Tara. Just fix it, like you always do. Fix it. Those 2 words hit me harder than the heat. Fix it. He had said that when I was 16 and he needed me to lie to the insurance company. He had said that when I was 22 and he needed rent money. He had said that when he crashed his truck and needed me to pay the mechanic off the books. Fix it. It wasn't a request for help. It was a command. It was the assertion of his ownership over my competence. He believed that my intelligence existed solely to clean up his messes. I looked at him. I really looked at him. I saw the lines of dissipation around his mouth. I saw the selfishness etched into his forehead. I saw a man who had never taken responsibility for a single action in his life because he had always had a woman, his wife, his mother, his daughter, to sweep up the glass. I didn't say anything. I just let the silence stretch. I let it hang there in the hot air. Heavy and suffocating. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. My father's smile faltered. He shifted his weight. He looked at my mother, then back at me. The silence was forcing him to hear his own words, and for the first time, he seemed to realize how pathetic they sounded. "Tara?" he whispered, uncertainly. "I am not your fixer," I said. My voice was steady, void of anger, void of pity. "I am not your insurance policy, and I am certainly not your bank." "But we're family," my mother sobbed. "How can you be so cold? After everything we did for you. We raised you. We paid for your leg." I felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "You didn't pay for my leg," I said, my voice cutting like a razor. "Insurance paid for my leg, and I paid for your business. I paid for your rent. I paid for your mistakes for 15 years. The ledger is closed. Mom, you are overdrawn." I turned back to the car door. "You can't do this," Blair screamed, grabbing my shoulder again. "I will sue you. I will find another lawyer. I will drag this out for years." I brushed her hand off my shoulder as if it were a piece of lint. "You already sued, Blair," I said, "and you lost. You can hire 100 lawyers. You can scream until your throat bleeds. But you signed the complaint. You triggered the clause. The money is gone." I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was hot against my back. I inserted the key and turned the ignition. The engine purred to life. The air conditioning blasted cold air into my face. They were still standing there. My father was banging on the window now. My mother was weeping into her hands. Blair was staring at me with a look of pure shock, as if the concept of consequences was an alien language she was hearing for the first time. I lowered the window just an inch. My father pressed his face to the glass. "Tara, don't drive away. Just talk to the trustee. Tell him to hold off. We can appeal." "He won't take your calls." "Dad," I said through the crack, "Arthur Prosser doesn't negotiate with people who owe the estate money." "Oh?" My father froze. "What do you mean, oh?" "You'll find out in the mail," I said. "Check your mailbox on Tuesday." I put the car in reverse. Blair ran around to the front of the car, trying to block me. She slammed her hands on the hood. "You leech!" she screamed, her face twisted and ugly. "You stole my life. You are a parasite." I put my foot on the brake. I looked at her through the windshield. She looked ridiculous. A grown woman in a designer dress, throwing a tantrum in a parking lot because she had to pay for her own lunch. I rolled the window down a little more. "Blair," I said. I didn't shout. I spoke clearly enough for her to hear me over the engine. She stopped screaming, panting heavily. "You call me a leech," I said. "You call me a parasite, but answer me one question." I looked her dead in the eye. "What was Grandpa's favorite breakfast?" Blair blinked. "What?" "His favorite breakfast," I repeated. "You said you loved him. You said you were the favorite. So tell me, what did he eat every single morning for the last 20 years? Blair opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at our mother for help. But Kendra was staring at the ground. "Oatmeal?" Blair guessed. "Eggs?" "He hated eggs," I said. "He was allergic to yolks. He ate rye toast with peach preserves and black coffee every single day." I shook my head. "You don't know what he ate. You don't know what medication he took. You don't know what he was afraid of. You don't know anything about him except his routing number." I took my foot off the brake. The car inched forward. Blair scrambled out of the way, realizing I wasn't going to stop. "That's why you lost, Blair," I said as I rolled past her. Not because of me, not because of the lawyers. You lost because you never actually knew the man you were trying to rob. I didn't look back. I accelerated out of the parking spot. Turning the wheel smoothly, I drove toward the exit gate. In the rearview mirror, I saw 3 small figures standing on the melting asphalt. They were arguing. My father was pointing at Blair. Blair was screaming at my mother. They were turning on each other, just as Grandpa predicted they would. When the money is gone, the cannibals have no one left to eat but themselves. I merged onto the main road. I turned up the radio. It was a classic rock station, playing a song Grandpa used to hum while he worked in the garden. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of alignment. The world was chaotic. Yes, people were greedy, but sometimes, just sometimes, if you did the paperwork right, if you kept the receipts, and if you waited for the gatekeeper, the math actually worked out. I checked my watch. Noon exactly. I had a lunch meeting at 1, and for the first time in my life, I was going to order whatever I wanted, and I wasn't going to feel guilty about the bill. 3 days after the hearing, my phone rang. It was not a frantic call from a family member, and it was not a telemarketer. It was the dry, precise ringtone I had assigned to Stonegate Fiduciary Services. I answered on the first ring. "Ms. Mendez," Arthur Prosser said. He did not waste time with pleasantries like asking how I was doing. "We have commenced the asset transfer protocols. The deed to the Elm Street property has been formally recorded in the name of the trust. The Vanguard accounts have been liquidated and moved to the escrow holding. We are currently auditing the physical contents of the residence for inventory." "Good," I said. I was sitting in my office at Kestrel Ridge, looking at a spreadsheet for a client who owned a chain of failing car washes. It felt mundane compared to the dismantling of my own family history. "Has there been any resistance?" "There has been noise," Prosser replied. "Mr. Sterling attempted to file an injunction to halt the transfer, claiming his clients were under emotional distress when they withdrew their motion. The court clerk rejected it before it even reached a judge's desk. We are now moving forward with the sanctions hearing." I leaned back in my chair. The sanctions hearing. That was the aftershock. Judge Calloway had not been making an idle threat. He had scheduled a formal review of Blair's conduct and Sterling's due diligence. "They are claiming it was a mistake," I said. "They are going to say they were grieving." "The court does not care about grief when you accuse a fiduciary of a felony," Prosser said coldly. "We are subpoenaing their financial records to prove motive. We believe the accusation of incapacity was not a mistake, but a calculated strategy to seize control of liquid assets to cover immediate debts. We are treating it as attempted fraud." Attempted fraud. It sounded harsh, but it was accurate. My family had not just been sad, they had been insolvent. "In the process of this investigation," Prosser continued, his voice shifting slightly, sounding almost like he was apologizing for what he was about to say, "we uncovered some historical documents. As the trustee, I have access to your grandfather's safe deposit box and his private correspondence files. There are things here regarding your parents' business, the hardware store." My stomach tightened. "What about it?" "It closed 17 years ago. They went bankrupt because of my medical bills." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long, heavy pause. "No, Ms. Mendez," Prosser said. "They did not?" I gripped the phone tighter. "Excuse me?" "I am looking at a series of IRS notices dating back to 1999, Prosser said. 5 years before your accident, your father stopped paying payroll taxes in 1999. By the time of your accident in 2004, the business was already subject to 3 separate federal tax liens. They were not bankrupt because of a $12,000 surgery. They were shut down by the federal government for tax evasion totaling over $150,000. I stopped breathing. The air in my office seemed to vanish. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "I have the seizure notices right here," Prosser said. "The timing of your accident was convenient for their narrative. But mathematically, the business was dead long before you ever got behind the wheel of that car. They used the sympathy from your injury to deflect questions from the neighbors about why the IRS was padlocking the doors. I closed my eyes. For 17 years, I had carried that guilt. I had let them call me a leech. I had let them tell me I destroyed the family legacy. And the whole time, they had been using my pain to cover up their crime. They hadn't just scapegoated me. They had laundered their reputation through my trauma. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. My voice was steady, but my hand was shaking. "Please add that to the file for the sanctions hearing." "It is already marked as Exhibit H," Prosser said. "I thought you should know." We hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the white wall of my office. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just felt a cold, hard knot in my chest loosen, unravel, and disappear. I wasn't the villain. I never had been. I was just the alibi. The fallout outside my office was accelerating. The sanctions hearing was set for next Tuesday, and the walls were closing in on Blair. She had made a fatal error in her financial planning. She had spent the inheritance before she got it. I learned through the grapevine, which in a town like Ridgefield meant the court clerks and the bank tellers, that Blair had leased a Range Rover 2 days before Grandpa died. She had put the down payment on a credit card, assuming she would pay it off within the month with the estate cash. Now, the credit card bill was due, the lease payment was due, and there was no cash coming. The creditors were not like family. You couldn't cry to American Express. You couldn't gaslight a leasing company. They started calling. Then came the legal bills. Sterling, realizing he was facing a sanctions hearing that could cost him his license to practice, had turned on his clients. He sent them an invoice for his services to date. It was rumored to be over $15,000. He demanded immediate payment, stating that he would place a lien on their personal property if they defaulted. My parents were in no position to help her. The revelation of the tax liens meant that their credit was permanently scarred. They had been surviving on a cycle of small loans and borrowing from Grandpa. That tap was now welded shut. And then, the press arrived. The Ridgefield Gazette ran a story on page 4. The headline was not sensational, but it was damaging. Local probate dispute reveals allegations of fraud. Sanctions pending in Mendez case. It didn't mention me by name. It referred to the plaintiffs and the corporate trustee. But in a small town, everyone knew who the plaintiffs were. The article quoted the judge's remarks about frivolous pleadings and dishonesty. It mentioned the video of the Christmas Eve incident. Blair couldn't go to her yoga studio anymore. My father couldn't go to the golf course. The social currency they valued more than actual money had been devalued to zero. They were not the grieving family anymore. They were the people who tried to trick a dying man and got caught. I decided it was time to go back to the house. I hadn't been there since the funeral. I had been avoiding it, afraid that the ghosts of the old arguments would still be hanging in the hallways. But now, armed with the truth about the business, I felt immune. I drove over on a Saturday morning. The for sale sign wasn't up yet, but the Trust landscaping crew was there, mowing the lawn. It looked pristine. It looked like a property under management, not a home. I unlocked the front door with my key. The house smelled of lemon polish and silence. The Trust had already sent in a cleaning crew to inventory the furniture. I walked through the living room. The spot where Grandpa's wheelchair used to sit was empty. The rug still had the indentations of the wheels. I walked down the hall to his study. This was the room where it had all happened. This was where he had sat for hours, looking out the window at the bird feeder. This was where we had the conversations that saved my life. The desk was clean. The Trust had removed the active financial files, but the personal items were still there. His reading glasses, a jar of peppermints, an old calculator with big buttons. It felt peaceful. It didn't feel like a place of tragedy. It felt like a command center that had been successfully decommissioned after a victory. I sat in his leather chair. It squeaked, a familiar sound that made my throat tight. I opened the center drawer. Inside, everything was organized. Grandpa was a man of precision. There were paper clips in a small box, rubber bands in another, and there, right in the center, was a small envelope. It was not a standard white envelope. It was a thick, cream-colored stationer's envelope, the kind he used for thank you notes. It was not sealed with wax. It was just tucked in. On the front, in his shaky, spidery handwriting, were 7 words. For Tara. When they finally say the word, I stared at it. The word. He didn't write what the word was. He didn't have to. He knew. He knew them better than I did. He knew exactly what weapon they would use to try to hurt me when the money was cut off. He knew they would call me a leech. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt light. There was only a single piece of paper inside. I opened the flap. I pulled out a folded sheet of yellow legal pad paper. It wasn't a formal letter. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note, dated 2 weeks before he died. Tara, if you are reading this, it means the trust held up. It means the gatekeeper did his job. And it means they called you the name. I know they called you a leech. I heard them say it to you when you were 16. I heard them say it when you were 20. I pretended to be deaf. But I heard every word. They made you believe that you owed us. They made you believe you were a deficit. But you need to know the truth. I kept a different set of books. Tara, I flipped the page. On the back, he had written a list. It was not a list of debts. It was a list of contributions. 2010. Tara paid the electric bill, $600, 2012. Tara paid the property tax, $2,000, 2015. Tara paid for the roof repair, $5,000, 2018. Tara paid off your father's gambling debt, $15,000. The list went on. It covered the front and back of the page. It detailed every single time I had saved them, every check I wrote, every crisis I solved. At the bottom of the list, he had done the math. He had drawn a thick line and written a total contributions by Tara Mendez, $142,500, and below that, in big bold letters, cost of leg surgery, $3,500. Result, you don't owe us, we owe you. I have instructed the trustee to treat these contributions not as gifts, but as loans made by you to the family estate. I saved the receipts you thought you threw away. I fished them out of the trash. I kept them. Open the blue file box in the closet. It is all there. Promissory notes. They didn't know they were signing them, but they signed them. Every time you gave them money, I had them sign a receipt for me. It wasn't a receipt. It was a debt acknowledgement. They called you a leech, but you are the creditor, and it is time to collect. I dropped the letter on the desk. I stared at the closet door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He hadn't just protected himself. He had spent the last 10 years building a trap within a trap. He knew I would never ask for the money back. He knew I was too conditioned to just give and give, so he had turned my generosity into a legal weapon without me even knowing it. He had tricked them into signing promissory notes. He had disguised them as receipts for him, probably saying something like, "Sign this, so I know you got the cash from Tara." And they, being greedy and lazy, had signed without reading. I walked to the closet. I opened the door. There, on the top shelf, was a blue file box. It was heavy. I pulled it down and set it on the desk. I opened the lid. Inside were hundreds of pieces of paper. Some were scraps. Some were formal receipts. Some were napkins. But every single one of them had a date, an amount, and the signature of Dorian Mendez, Kendra Mendez, or Blair Mendez. I picked up one from 3 years ago. It was a check I had written to Blair for car repairs. Grandpa had clipped it to a piece of paper where Blair had signed, received $2,000 from Tara Mendez for vehicle maintenance. Repayment to be made upon demand. She must have thought she was just signing a note for Grandpa. She never thought upon demand meant anything, but to a trustee, upon demand means now. I sat back in the chair and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for a lifetime. I wasn't just free, I was powerful. They were facing sanctions. They were facing public humiliation. And now, thanks to a dying old man who loved me enough to play the long game, they were facing a debt collector who had every single receipt. I picked up my phone. I dialed Arthur Prosser again. "Ms. Mendez?" he answered. Did you forget something? No, I said. My voice was strong. But I found something. I found the blue box. There was a pause. Then, I heard the smile in his voice. Ah, Prosser said. Mr. Mendez told me you might find that. He said to wait until you called. He said you needed to be the one to pull the trigger. The trigger is pulled, I said. I want to execute the recovery of debts owed to the estate. I want to enforce the promissory notes. All of them? Prosser asked. I looked at the list. I looked at the Leech letter. I thought about Blair screaming in the parking lot. I thought about my father kicking the door. All of them, I said. Every single penny. Very well, Prosser said. I will draft the demand letters today. They will receive them on the same day as the sanctions hearing. It will be a very educational Tuesday for them. I hung up. I looked at the empty room. Thank you, Grandpa. I whispered into the silence. I took the envelope. I put it in my bag. I didn't need to keep the blue box. The trustee would come for that. I walked out of the house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was cooling down. I got into my car. I looked at my face in the rearview mirror. I looked different. The lines of tension around my eyes were gone. I wasn't waiting for the gatekeeper anymore. I had the keys. And for the first time in 17 years, the balance sheet was finally perfectly black. The blue file box sat on the mahogany desk like a bomb that had been defused, only to be rewired into something far more dangerous. I reached in and pulled out the first stack of papers. They were not sentimental letters. They were not old photographs. They were promissory notes. I picked up the one on top. It was dated 4 years ago. It was for the amount of $8,000. The memo line read, Emergency roof repair / residential loan. At the bottom, in bold, blue ink, was my father's signature. I remembered that day. It had been raining for a week, and water was pouring into my parents' bedroom. My father had called me, frantic, saying they had no liquidity. I had written the check. But I hadn't known what happened next. Grandpa must have called them over. He must have said something like, Tara needs this for her records, or sign this just to keep things straight. And my father, desperate for the cash and arrogant enough to believe he would never be held accountable, had signed it. I flipped through the stack. It was a graveyard of my generosity. There was a note for the transmission on Blair's car, $2,500, signed by Blair. There was a note for business tax arrears, $12,000, signed by my mother. There was a note for legal retainer, DUI defense, $5,000, signed by my father. Grandpa hadn't just saved the receipts. He had formalized them. He had turned every single act of my leeching into a legally binding debt instrument. But the real weapon was the cover letter attached to the bundle. It was a legal assignment, drafted by the same high-powered firm that created the trust. Assignment of debt. The header read, I, Harlan Mendez, hereby assign all rights, title, and interest in the attached promissory notes to the Harlan Mendez Revocable Trust. The trustee is instructed to hold these notes in abeyance so long as the debtors remain in good standing with the family estate. I read the next paragraph, and my breath hitched. This was the trigger. This was the dead man's switch. However, in the event that any of the debtors named herein initiate legal action against the trust, contest the validity of the trust, or attempt to remove the trustee, the good standing clause shall be immediately voided. The trustee is then instructed to demand immediate repayment of the principal and interest in full. Failure to pay within 30 days shall result in civil litigation to attach assets, garnish wages, and foreclose on any real property owned by the debtors. I sat back in the leather chair. The room was silent, but my mind was roaring. Grandpa knew. He knew they would sue. He knew they couldn't help themselves. So he had built a trap where the bait was the inheritance, but the spring was their own debt. They had sued to get money they didn't earn. In doing so, they had triggered a clause that forced them to pay back money they had already spent. I picked up the phone. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. The time for guilt was over. The time for accounting had arrived. "Mr. Prosser," I said when he answered. "I have the notes, and I see the acceleration clause." "I have the digital copies here as well," Prosser said. His voice was crisp, professional. "I was waiting for your authorization. As the primary beneficiary, you technically have the power to forgive these debts if you choose. Do you wish to offer them forgiveness?" I looked at the signature on the DUI loan. I thought about my father kicking the door. I thought about Blair calling me a parasite in the parking lot while driving a car I had helped pay to fix. "No," I said. "I do not wish to forgive. I wish to collect." "Very good," Prosser said. "I will issue the demand for payment notices immediately. They will be sent via overnight courier. They will arrive tomorrow morning." "Add the interest," I said. "The notes say 3% compounded annually. Calculate it." "Of course," Prosser replied. "We are fiduciaries. Ms. Mendez, we are precise." The next 24 hours were a blur of quiet, deadly efficiency. I went to work, I sat in meetings, I drank coffee. But in the back of my mind, I was tracking the courier package. It arrived at my parents' house at 10 in the morning on Tuesday. At 10:15. My phone rang. It was my father. I sent it to voicemail. At 10:16, it rang again. My mother. Voicemail. At 10:20, Blair called. I let it ring until the very last second. Then I picked up. "Tara." Blair was screaming. She wasn't using words. She was just making sounds of pure, unfiltered panic. "What is this? What is this paper?" "Hello? Blair," I said calmly. "I assume you received the mail from the trustee." "It says I owe $18,000, she shrieked. "It says I have 30 days to pay or they are going to garnish my wages. They can't do that. That was gift money. You gave that to me." "I gave it to you," I agreed. "And you signed a promissory note to Grandpa agreeing to pay it back upon demand. You signed it, Blair. I have the copy with your signature right here. Do you remember? The blue ink? The little smiley face you drew next to your name because you thought it was a joke?" But that was for Grandpa," she stammered. "He's dead. He can't collect." "The trust can," I said. "And because you sued the trust, you triggered the collection clause. You wanted to play legal hardball. Blair, this is what hardball looks like." "I don't have $18,000, she sobbed. "I can't pay this. My credit cards are maxed out. If they garnish my wages, I'll lose my apartment." "Then I suggest you sell the Range Rover," I said. "Or maybe ask Mom and Dad for a loan. Oh wait, you can't, because they just got a bill for $120,000. There was silence on the other end. A horrified, suffocating silence. "You did this," she whispered venomously. "You planned this whole thing." "I didn't plan it," I said. "I just kept the receipts. And frankly, Blair, you should be grateful. You wanted a share of the estate. Grandpa left you something very valuable. He left you a lesson in responsibility. It is the first honest thing anyone has ever given you." "We can fix this," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "We can undo the lawsuit. We can tell the judge we drop everything. Please, Tara, just tell the trustee to stop." "I can't," I said. "The clause is automatic. Once the contest was filed, the debt became due. It is out of my hands. It is in the hands of the math now." "You are a monster," she hissed. "No," I said softly. "I am just the bank, and the bank is closing." I hung up. The final hearing was a formality, but it was a necessary one. We gathered in Judge Calloway's courtroom one last time. The atmosphere was radically different. There was no bluster from Sterling. There were no tears from my mother. They sat huddled at the plaintiff's table, like survivors of a shipwreck who had just realized the rescue boat wasn't coming. My father looked 10 years older. He was wearing the same suit, but it hung loosely on him. He knew that the demand letter he had received wasn't a bluff. He knew that the trust had the power to place a lien on his house, the house he was already behind on. He was facing total financial ruin. Judge Calloway entered. He didn't waste time. "We are here to resolve the matter of sanctions and the final disposition of the assets," the judge said. He looked at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, regarding the Rule 11 sanctions for filing frivolous claims of incapacity and abuse, the court has reviewed the financial records submitted by the trustee. It is the opinion of this court that this lawsuit was not filed in good faith, but was a predatory attempt to seize assets." Sterling stared at his shoes. "We accept the court's findings, Your Honor. You are ordered to pay the legal fees of the trust in the amount of $22,000, the judge ruled. "And I am referring your conduct to the State Bar for review." Sterling flinched. That was the death knell for his reputation. "As for the plaintiffs," the judge continued, turning his gaze to my family, "the no contest clause is upheld. You are disinherited from the Mendez Trust. You will receive nothing." He paused, shuffling a paper. "Furthermore, the trustee has informed the court that there are outstanding debts owed by the plaintiffs to the estate. The court acknowledges the validity of the promissory notes submitted into evidence. The trustee is fully authorized to pursue collection of these debts through all available civil channels, including asset seizure if necessary." My mother put her head on the table and began to weep. It wasn't a performance this time. It was the sound of a woman watching her life dismantle itself. My father looked at me. His eyes were pleading. He mouthed the word family. I looked right through him. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cool, clean sensation of a balance sheet that finally equaled zero. "Court is adjourned," the judge said. I stood up. I didn't wait for them to approach me. I didn't wait for the parking lot confrontation. I walked out of the swinging gate, down the aisle, and toward the heavy wooden doors. "Tara!" I heard Blair's voice behind me. It was weak, broken. I didn't turn around. I pushed the doors open and walked into the cool marble hallway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts list. I scrolled to Dad. I didn't hit block. Blocking implies that you are trying to keep something out. Blocking implies that they still have the power to disturb you. I hit delete. I scrolled to Mom. Delete. I scrolled to Blair. Delete. It was like sweeping crumbs off a table. It was a simple act of hygiene. They were not my family anymore. They were just names in a database that I no longer needed to access. I walked out of the courthouse and into the sunlight. The air was crisp. The sky was a brilliant, impossible blue. I walked to my car, but I didn't get in immediately. I stood there, leaning against the door, and looked at my watch. 1:30 in the afternoon. For 17 years, I had been checking this watch, waiting. Waiting for the right time to speak. Waiting for the right time to leave. Waiting for the gatekeeper to come and save me. I looked at the face of the watch, watching the second hand sweep around. Tick, tick, tick. I realized then that I wasn't waiting anymore. The gatekeeper hadn't just been Arthur Prosser. The gatekeeper had been me. I was the one who kept the records. I was the one who drove the car. I was the one who held the door shut when the wolves were scratching at the wood. Grandpa had given me the tools, but I was the one who had built the fortress. I looked back at the courthouse one last time. I saw my family coming out of the doors. They stopped at the top of the stairs, arguing, gesturing, pointing fingers at each other. They looked small. They looked insignificant. I got into my car. I put the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life. I adjusted the rearview mirror, but I didn't look at them. I adjusted it so I could see the road behind me, the road that led away from Ridgefield, away from the hardware store, away from the debt. I put the car in drive. They could knock on my door all they wanted. They could call. They could scream. But from now on, the house on Elm Street and the life of Tara Mendez was under new management, and the sign on the door read, "Closed to the public." Thank you so much for listening to this story. I know revenge stories can be intense, but I hope this one gave you a sense of justice being served. Where are you listening from right now? Are you listening while driving, cooking, or maybe winding down for the night? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed seeing the Leech narrative get flipped on its head, please make sure to subscribe to the Nina Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that notification bell to help this story reach even more people. Your support really helps us keep these stories coming. Stay safe, and remember, always keep your receipts.